thing. He's George Siemens. I think they are getting ready with all the last details before taking the stage, so let me briefly introduce him. He researches how human and artificial cognition intersect in knowledge processes. He's also a co-founder, a chief scientist, and architect of SNHU's Human System, that is an organization building resources to respond to systems' impact on AI, on learning, and also wellness. I think we're ready here now. Are you, George? Okay, please come to the stage. Welcome him, George Siemens. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning, and appreciate the opportunity to spend some time talking about what I think is a significant misjudgment on the part of higher education over the last certainly several years, but likely going back well over a decade. And that is a somewhat fatigued and even beleaguered response to AI as a mechanism for changing and innovating the university sector as a whole. So I'm going to talk through what I think is happening and what I think we need to do as universities to be more responsive and more capable to utilize AI as, again, a mechanism for ensuring our students are successful, but also ensuring that universities continue to remain relevant in a pretty quickly changing world. I'm going to talk about 4 distinct topic areas. The bulk of the talk, I'm going to look at some of the literature around AI and learning. And this is just to give you a bit of a sense on what do we know from literature that works well in learning and learning-related processes. And I'm going to build a little bit on what Charles was just talking about, which is the intersection between human and machine. It's a co-creation process, not necessarily antagonistic process. I'm going to talk very briefly, 2 slides worth about AI specifically, and I'm just going to detail what it is that AI does and what some of the current trends are that we're seeing in AI. I assume everyone in the audience doesn't need the 500th what is AI primer, so I'm just going to talk about what's happening right now specifically around LLMs that have an educational implication. I'm going to, from there, go a little bit about what does this mean specifically from a university lens and how universities might change. And then finally, I'll present sort of a 6 area of priorities that universities need to pay attention to if they want to start getting more actively involved in the AI conversation. So to get started, we're at an interesting time in history in that we are sort of at the tail end of an extended period of emotional turmoil as a society. We have seen a significant increase in escalation in areas of emotional need or in areas of loneliness, and mental health impacts are certainly growing, not only limited to the effects of the pandemic, but just stats and indicators prior to the pandemic that said, hey, as people, we're not doing okay emotionally and mentally. Some of the systems that society has created for us aren't serving all of us equitably, and that's a significant challenge. And so there's ways that we need to be better in how we support and engage with society writ large, not just with individual learners. But what happens is each time we have a new technology, we introduce a bit of a spacing effect. And that spacing effect means social media, as an illustration, initially came on and it allowed us to connect with people from around the world. But nowadays, that connection is actually producing disconnection. And so what initially gave us the opportunity to do new things with new groups of people suddenly become at odds and in conflict with new groups of people. So the way social media has been deployed by itself was naive and effective, but once you make it available for algorithmic distortion and for propaganda, suddenly it becomes harmful and actually disruptive to the system as a whole. And so we need to keep that in the back of our minds, because the lessons of social media on mental health and on society wellness will be almost insignificant compared to the threat and the risks that AI will pose into the public conversational sphere. So each new wave of technology forces us to evaluate the spaces that we occupy and how we remain human in those environments. And that's one of the reasons I particularly appreciate the theme of the Education Forum here around that human component in AI settings. So when you look at traditional learning literature, there's been a long period of acknowledging that thinking and learning doesn't just happen in our brains. Right? There's a range of theorists that from embodied cognition to distributed cognition to some externalization of concepts and ideas, we're constantly putting human knowledge into physical things or objects or concepts in the world. And most established theorists and philosophers would argue that you are intelligent as a function of the networks that you exist within. And those networks traditionally have been tools and resources we've created, such as books and related artifacts. But increasingly now, they're starting to become systems that are AI compliant or AI enabled. So when I think of artificial intelligence, to me, it's not a tool. It's not a resource that we use. It is a node within our cognitive network, and that has significant implications educationally. And that's because as a species, we don't exist in these systems as isolated entities. The best way to describe it is we, and not just as humans, but species, all of life, all of society, coexists and exists fundamentally as a function of networks. The idea of individual is actually antithetical in terms of growth opportunities and the advancement of society. All of our capabilities are a byproduct of how we're networked and connected. So we did a paper a while ago where we wanted to understand if we bring AI into these learning processes, such as complex problem solving, what are the effects of that? What are the critical components that are involved, assuming that you agree with me that networks are the foundational underpinnings. And so we looked at essentially when you have human and artificial cognition intersecting in areas of metacognition, such as regulation and learning management, in affect, related to things such as emotion and trust and confidence and the way that we connect with one another with a sense of security and confidence, what does that look like? Or if you then take and look at the cognitive practices, things like remembering, what's the importance of memory when AI is at your fingertips? Or which parts of memory remain relevant when AI is at your fingertips? Because one of the things that AI does in this conversation is move capability questions to a new plane. It's not that it makes those things irrelevant. It means that we are related to some of those core concepts differently than we perhaps have been in the past. And similarly with social practices and collaboration and engagement and working together. So when you bring AI into this process, one argument that I've been making to colleagues for years is that every single thing that we know and understand about human learning and human knowledge growth needs to be reevaluated with an understanding of AI as a potential mediating and transforming agent within that ecosystem. And so we looked at, if you take these two pieces and you bring them together, because that's what we essentially see happening. It's not that we're saying AI is a tool off to the side. I'm arguing that AI is the first injection of intelligence in the human system since our neocortex came online. So it is an alien intelligence. It's not exactly like us, but it does certain things that can make some stuff easier. For all its criticisms, for its hallucinations, for its biases, AI is a type of an intelligence that we can co-think and co-create with. This isn't new. This is going back even over a decade when the stock market in particular, when there was a period of these little blips of sudden crashes. There's a research report that was put out by Johnson where he said these systems where AI is starting to make decisions, they're moving so fast that we are at a point where there is an inability for humans to intervene in real time, meaning it's machines have taken over large swaths of those kinds of processes, and what it's done for us, we can't participate in real time, so the human cognitive function is to escalate, which means we move to a higher plane because we can't do the granular level performance at the same level that AI meaningfully can. And that's produced work such as this paper by Rowan and al., where they said we need to start thinking about theories of learning that don't just integrate human-to-machine interactions. It's machine-to-machine interactions that we need to think about because there are swaths of decisions in some high-risk areas, including medical and military, where AI is making decisions often without a human input layer brought in. And so to start thinking about complex problem solving and the integration of human and artificial cognition into this kind of a landscape is critical. So a paper we did a few years ago, we looked at exactly this question, is what happens when you have two types of intelligence that maybe don't quite understand each other, but we know that meaningful integration between the two is going to be important for solving all the problems that humanity faces, from homelessness to inequality to climate change. How do we begin to make those two play together? And what is that intersecting space where learning and sense-making and meaning-making happen meaningfully at that level? So we did a paper in just last year, actually, where we looked at the literature that to date has looked at AI and its impact on the education setting. Specifically, what are people doing with AI in classrooms in a practical way, not in a highfalutin future way that says, oh, we'll all have a personal agent and we'll all be happy and have a robot in our home. But in a practical way, what's actually happening in classrooms? And so the number one set of applications are ones that still remain prominent, which is adaptive systems and personalization. That's been a holy grail of education for decades, but it says rather than one student or one teacher teaching 30 students, everyone has a one-to-one relationship. Like was mentioned previously, this is the idea of Bloom's 2 sigma, where the inclusion of a tutor can move a C student to an A student with the right level of support and guidance. Profiling and prediction was an important one that came up as well. A big part of what universities haven't done historically is to understand their students. You know, what are their skill sets, what are their capabilities outside of a grade? And so it's this idea of how can we better profile, and then if we profile, predict which students will succeed, which students are at risk of potentially dropping out. Assessment and evaluation is another important one, and then interestingly, tutors were right at the bottom, at least of this cluster. It wasn't a huge area of use. This data would obviously be very different if we were to do this report again in a year's time, because one of the top adaptations of the growth of generative AI has been tutoring and adaptive systems of that type. So the benefits then are straightforward: personalized learning, positive influence on the education process, better administrative activity from a university level as well, helping get insight into how students are learning, and then also as a way of doing more effective assessment. But that doesn't mean everything is all delightful, because there's some significant challenges that are introduced with AI in this landscape. One, probably top, remains the ethical dynamic. How do we ensure that AI helps, not harms people? How do we preserve the integrity? How do we preserve the security of the student in this area of growing automation and increased technology? A lot of attention to curriculum development. How do we use AI well to create courses? And then a range of infrastructure questions that I'll address once I get a little further toward the end. The big research gaps in the literature are what you would expect. Ethics keeps coming up top of the list because that remains one of the bigger unspoken challenges in the university sector as a whole. And not just university, across all of society. A lot more questions about methodology. This is a conversation I was having with my wife on this as well recently, which is in education we've typically done, we take a concept and we develop a theory around it. Theory sometimes is the byproduct of extensive research, and then we use that to guide and shape decisions going forward. But now we're at a slightly different landscape in that we can use large swaths of data and rapidly move that forward to try and gain insight into students and student performance. When we started to look at this more from an LLM side, there was acceleration on a number of fronts, but the same questions remain. Profiling, prediction, feedback remain key concerns in the educational landscape, whether we're looking traditional AI or emerging AI. We did a paper, actually I think it was this year, where one of the outcomes was we looked at student focus and student engagement when you bring AI into the classroom setting. And the interesting thing we found was that students don't necessarily learn from AI, they instead rely on AI, which is an interesting distinction. It doesn't have the same learning capability in all settings. As always, it's a function of pedagogical approach and pedagogical models. One of the big papers, though, that I always refer to, and this is an important concept when we talk methodology, is that a lot of the activity that happens in a classroom is based on, or that happens in research is based on a setting that's disconnected from reality. And Anne Brown did a fantastic paper, was it 40 plus years ago, where she looked at this design experiment that the entirety of a classroom is a learning ecosystem for learning research rather than these one-off experimental design settings. And that's exactly the kind of activity that we try to do in digital spaces now. Through the use of data and data collection, which we get from a range of sources, student information systems, instruments or survey instruments we deploy, learning management systems, we can get a fairly holistic assessment or lens of what a student is doing and where she is in her overall learning process. So with that as a backdrop, I'll take the last 10 minutes to talk through these final sections. So if we look at technology over the last few decades, we can say the open education movement fundamentally taught us that we can scale content with minimal cost additions. Each new duplication of a web page or a PDF is really insignificant compared to the cost of duplicating a new textbook. A second thing that we learned through open online courses, or MOOCs in some cases, is that we can scale teaching. We can have 100,000 or 500,000 students take a course, and it's much less expensive from a lecture lens, if that's the primary pedagogy, in that kind of a setting. And AI is at the early cusp, I believe, of teaching us that we can accelerate and scale interaction, so the connections that we have on sort of a one-to-one basis from a tutoring perspective. The significant trends I want to identify here, though, relate to where is the current state of AI. After ChatGPT and the growth of generative AI, the hype that we had in 2022 and early last year, we're starting to see some very practical groundings of these technologies, not least of which is the prevalence of AI in everything, from our cars to software to the platforms we use, growing multimedia and multimodal, and also a lot of attention being paid to open source LLMs or open source software. A lot of that's driven by Meta, interestingly enough, and a growing group of organizations, notably stuff like Mistral and others, that are really promoting open LLMs. There's also attention being paid to very small LLMs, which you're going to see more and more on your Android or on your iPhone devices. Fee 2, Fee 3 actually just came out at the end of April as well, so we're starting to see them accelerating. Similarly, AI pairings, meaning AI with traditional robotics, are starting to come together, and I think most of us in this room will have an AI-driven robot in our homes within the next 5 years doing routine-related house tasks. A lot of attention now, this is maybe a little more relevant to some of you who are running technical teams, there's been a significant acceleration of platform technologies that make AI development easy. If you were to do something with an LLM 16 months ago or 12 months ago, you needed a fairly high technical capability, but now in environments like AWS or Vertex, you can quickly run up a series of models, test and deploy with a team of one who has fairly fundamental understandings of the process. We're also seeing a lot of, I'll skip that one, more and more wearable devices. Ray-Bans is an interesting one. Again, Meta's driving, which is the ability to have your glasses as you're walking, see a scene in front of you. In Llama 3, which is Meta's open LLM, you can ask it, what am I looking at? What's this picture? And it will search and provide an answer back to you audibly on your glasses as well. And then a lot of tooling things, which is a little beyond where we are today, but tools like DSPy and LangChain that make this process of managing multiple LLM integrations much more effective. So what are some of the implications of this? Well, first of all, I think AI will impact roughly everything that a university does. There's no sector that's not going to be challenged by it, and I do think it represents a systems level challenge for the sector. And I don't think universities see that, and I don't think many of them are responding as urgently as they should. Because if you look at, one of the main things we do is we generate knowledge and we communicate knowledge. That's our role as a university. And AI plays in all of those territories. I mean, here's just a range of tools that are knowledge adjacent generating technologies. Some of them have been deprecated, like Galactica was briefly put out but then paused. But there's a lot that you can do with this growing suite of AI tools that intersect with human creativity and human knowledge capability. The system itself, as an enterprise, is already in a process of unbundling. It's no longer a self-contained system. A lot of what we offer is increasingly being done by a range of providers. And we're going to start to see exactly the same effect happening in AI tools. If you're a leader in a university, you're going to get a range of providers and technology companies coming up to you, selling you AI technologies that do everything from tutoring, to content creation, to assessment, to student recruiting, to chatbot engagement, and so on. So it's a constant influx of new technologies and new approaches. And so the way that we're going to adopt as a sector is really going to be one of three: a direct response to a simple problem, a platform-based response, or as a transformational angle or transformational opportunity. From a system-preserving lens, the first or the second one, it's about just taking AI and helping it solve a problem, like advising, or providing better student support, or the idea of a learner co-pilot. Microsoft Copilot and others are already making that available, or doing things like adaptive feedback. That's what universities such as ASU and what you're seeing with University of Florida, they're taking this kind of an approach where they're largely going out and just finding a problem and solving it with some function of AI. If you want system-changing approaches, though, you need to start thinking very differently about your literacies, about developing personal learning graphs and personal models of a learner that transcends a course, even transcends their lives. Computed curriculum, not pre-structured textbooks, but curriculum that's generated based on what a learner knows, and integration of labor market needs into that educational process as well. So we're talking about not doing education as usual, but doing education in a fundamentally different way. So the idea then is this articulation of an AI-first university. And an AI-first university is one where AI is involved in all aspects of the organization, from the infrastructure through to admissions, teaching, assessment, curriculum, and the research process. And I'll run through 6 of those very quickly, but one is the infrastructure, the pipeline, the data lake. So any AI deployment is fundamentally a data challenge. Secondly, it's about building institutional capability with AI. Does the organization know what AI is and how AI performs and what it does? Thirdly, there's a range of questions that relate to the leadership and policy and governance. How does the university enable AI experimentation? How does it protect university reputation through effective AI engagement? Adaptive and responsive teaching methods. As noted, this is already prevalent in the literature, but how do we begin to use AI in such a way that it is focused one-to-one support for learners? How do we improve the personalized experience so that each individual is met at her needs, not just cognitively, but metacognitively, affectively, socially, and so on. So it's a very nuanced response to individual learner needs. And then also the acceleration of research through the utilization of AI. Doing a simple literature review is now dramatically different through the inclusion of tools like Elicit, Consensus, or Iris AI. So I think at the end of the final several slides, one of the critical challenges I want to emphasize for anyone that's initiating the AI conversation is get the data and the related architecture right. More than almost anything else, this is a critical challenge. There are needs of building capabilities institutionally. What I mean by that is being AI capable as an organization and having the technical capacity to train, fine-tune models, build your own bots. Those are expected. But at the institution-wide concern of infrastructure is critical. We just released a paper for discussion yesterday, actually, on a global data consortium where we tried to lay out how should universities at scale begin collaborating and sharing data so that you can learn from your peers rather than try and do everything on your own. So the university AI response should be through multi-institution collaboration and sharing across operational data analysis, data science planes, and then ultimately addressing and driving impact. So it's a critical outcome. We have a white paper that's now out for review from the American Council on Education, if anyone's interested on that. Final points. We're really getting at this idea where most of education has been about teaching people knowledge-related things, the epistemology question. And I think we're now moving to the ontology question, like who are we as human beings? How do we develop human beings? How do we help people become more engaged, more productive, and more effective members of society. You know, any of the kinds of things that are here, like what is it that we should be teaching? How should we be teaching people and learners places of being in the world? How should we be driving their capability to navigate complexity, to engage with non-human forms of intelligence, and then as a byproduct of that, to be sort of proactive, engaged, and anticipating potential harmful effects of AI as we go forward? Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Wonderful intervention. Yes, for the next guest. Thank you. Thank you very much again. Now we are moving forward, and I'm going to switch again into Spanish. Al comenzar el día, Nieves Segovia, que está aquí justo delante de mí, os hablaba muy brevemente del modelo que hemos construido para diseñar este evento y el copiloto que ha generado también para incluir las aportaciones de todos ustedes, de todos los asistentes, y poder también ayudar a cualquier institución al proceso de adopción de la inteligencia artificial en el contexto educativo, algo tan esencial de lo que hoy estamos hablando aquí. Así que para conocer más sobre esta plataforma en concreto y las posibilidades que tiene, voy a darle la palabra a nuestro siguiente invitado. Él es Rafael Pérez, director de la práctica de la inteligencia artificial y datos de Globan, que nos explique cómo se ha organizado todo este evento y la, me consta, sorprendente plataforma que hay detrás. Así que, Rafael, por favor.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, en primer lugar, desde Globan, simplemente expresar nuestra gratitud por poder estar en un evento de este tipo. Globan como empresa que crece en nativa digital, nativa de inteligencia artificial, es el tipo de cosas que nos encanta hacer, nos apasiona, ¿no? Me presento un poco, soy Rafael Pérez, encargado de la práctica de inteligencia artificial en Globan para Europa. Llevo más de 20 años trabajando en inteligencia artificial. Es verdad que antes se hacía de inteligencia artificial. Obviamente ahora, pues con todo el boom de la IA generativa, es un camino imparable. Pero ya hace 20 años hacían cosas, ¿vale? Voy a poner un ejemplo muy concreto que es, y los que vivís aquí, ¿no?, en España, en los centros comerciales, en el Corte Inglés, si miráis hacia arriba cuando entráis, hay un aparato que cuenta las personas que entran y que salen. Eso es computer vision, inteligencia artificial, que ya hace 20 años se hacía, ¿vale? Esto me da pie también para lo siguiente, ¿no? En los 20 años, en base a todas estas experiencias, puedo decir que lo que se está montando aquí es algo que es totalmente pionero, que es impresionante. O sea, me apasiona, después de 20 años, encontrar pues, el nivel de gente que hay aquí, el nivel de los contenidos, ahora lo vemos, y realmente lo que ha montado, ¿no?, en este caso SEC, para la comunidad educativa, ¿vale? Creo que es totalmente pionero, totalmente innovador. Si nos vamos directamente a la plataforma, al final, Emily, lo que habéis visto esta mañana, es la punta del iceberg, ¿no? Pero ¿qué es lo que hay detrás? ¿Vale? Simplemente resaltar 3 mensajes. Todo el evento, como hemos comentado esta mañana, se ha generado, se ha diseñado en base a inteligencia artificial. ¿Cuáles son las mesas que tiene que haber? ¿Cuáles son los contenidos? Etcétera, etcétera. Mensaje número 2. ¿Qué es lo que hay disponible para este evento? Pues lo que hay es una plataforma con una base de conocimiento súper potente de más de 300 documentos que los ponentes y el propio organizador han ido incorporando, ¿vale? Con lo cual esto supone un nivel de interacción a contenidos top en el mundo de la educación. Pero esto no se queda solo aquí, ¿vale? O sea, la ambición de esta plataforma es que sea la plataforma vertical de educación a nivel internacional, ¿no? Y que se pueda desarrollar nuevos casos de uso y luego veremos os enseñaré cuál es la visión de esa evolución, ¿vale? Perdón. Si entramos en el detalle, ¿vale? Voy a intentar explicaros qué es lo que hay detrás, ¿no?, de Emily. Lo que hay detrás es toda esta plataforma core que lo que hemos estado haciendo hasta este día es incorporar contenidos muy relevantes, como os digo, de cada una de las ponencias y de todo el evento, ¿vale? Todo esto al final tiene una forma de interactuar con la plataforma. Tenemos a Emily como avatar. También se puede interactuar a nivel de chat, ¿vale? Todo esto al final, ahora vamos a la parte interna, pero claro, todo esto necesita, ¿no? Engancharse pues, con los LLMs, ¿no? Las soluciones de generación de lenguaje. Internamente, pues hay una serie de capacidades que son imprescindibles para que todo esto funcione, ¿vale? Os voy a poner el ejemplo visualizando qué es lo que ha pasado cuando Salva hacía una pregunta, ¿no? Cuando Salva hacía la pregunta al avatar, había un contenido de audio, ¿no? Ese contenido de audio se traduce a texto, ¿no? El famoso speech to text. O sea, toda esa pregunta se traduce en texto. ¿Qué es lo siguiente que hace la plataforma? Interpretar sobre ese texto cuál ha sido la pregunta. Una vez que se tiene que el sistema ha identificado cuál es la pregunta, busca en toda esa base de conocimiento de 200 documentos los distintos ingredientes que le ayudan a componer una respuesta con sentido, ¿vale? Esa respuesta con sentido lo genera en texto, ¿vale? Y luego de vuelta, ¿qué tenemos que hacer? Ese texto tenemos que transformarlo en voz y tenemos que llevarlo a una expresión de Emily hablado, ¿vale? Todo eso es lo que está pasando. Entonces, imaginaros cuál sería el esfuerzo humano de hacer todo eso, ¿no? En ese tiempo, ¿vale? Al final, todo este sistema lo que permite, ¿no? Es ese acceso a mucha información, procesar, sintetizar una respuesta, ¿vale? El punto muy, muy valioso, el core, esa base de conocimiento educativa es lo que genera este valor a la plataforma, ¿vale? Porque es lo que va a permitir, a través de enriquecerlo, pues generar un entorno colaborativo de acceso a información de colaboración con documentos, ¿vale? Al final todo esto tiene dos modos, ¿vale? Lo habéis visto. Un modo de Q&A, preguntas-respuestas, y un modo más abierto, generativo, ¿vale? En el que Emily se compone sus respuestas en base a, bueno, pues su mejor entendimiento de los contenidos, ¿vale? Esto es lo que tenemos aquí. Lo hemos visto en esta sesión plenaria y los vamos a ver en las sesiones, en las mesas redondas. Se podrá interactuar con esta solución. Vale, esto es lo que se ha hecho en el evento, ¿no? Pero ¿cuál es la ambición? ¿Vale? O sea, aquí esta plataforma va a permitir nuevos casos de uso basados en inteligencia artificial, ¿vale? Uno de ellos va a ser la continuidad de esta plataforma de contenidos, ¿vale? ¿Y cómo se va a evolucionar? Esto es algo que estará disponible unas semanas después del evento, ¿vale? ¿Qué contendrá? Pues contendrá, por un lado, esos contenidos de los ponentes que ya teníamos, información del evento, más las transcripciones de lo que se vaya hablando en las sesiones. Con lo cual, estaremos enriqueciendo mucho más esa base de conocimiento, ¿vale? ¿Qué tendremos más? Pues la capacidad de no solo interactuar con Emily o con un chat, sino la posibilidad de interactuar por muchos más canales. WhatsApp, Instagram, Teams, canales que de alguna forma van a facilitar esa interacción, ¿vale? ¿Y qué vamos a tener también? O sea, todo esto, esta mañana teníamos una sesión, ¿no? sobre ética en AI, regulación, etcétera, etcétera, ¿vale? O sea, la regulación, bueno, pues está avanzando, tendrá distintos niveles de madurez, pero nosotros lo que incorporamos es ese guardrail, ¿vale? Ese guardrail que se ha hablado esta mañana, que tiene que ver con controlar cada una de las respuestas que se dan, ¿vale? Tener una medición de todas las interacciones y que nos permitan tomar decisiones de esto sí se puede, esto no se puede y cómo lo mejoramos, ¿vale? O sea, esta plataforma incorpora esa capacidad, ¿vale? ¿Qué más cosas? Hablamos de este caso de uso, que como decía es algo que se pondrá a disposición unas semanas, pero también esta plataforma está pensada para tener casos de uso adicionales, ¿vale? Una de las áreas más impactadas por esta revolución del GenAI es la atención. La atención a cliente, atención a estudiantes, atención, en este caso, a familias, ¿vale? Hemos puesto, o sea, tenemos ese primer caso de uso, pero también un soporte a los estudiantes cuando se incorporan a la universidad en cuanto a información, en cuanto a todo lo que necesitan saber en su proceso de incorporación y también de asesoramiento a las familias que van entrando, ¿vale? Con lo cual, mensaje. O sea, esto es simplemente, o sea, no es simplemente lo que se hace en el evento, sino una gran plataforma vertical en el mundo de educación, que como os decía, y bajo mis años de experiencia, es totalmente puntero y puede ser un antes y después en el mundo de la educación, ¿vale? Con lo cual, por mi parte, os animo a colaborar con los contenidos y que en las sesiones pues, también podáis comprobar cómo funciona la plataforma. Gracias a todos y un saludo.
Al equipo. Gracias, Rafael. Pues que así sea, que sea un antes y un después. Muchísimas gracias por tu exposición y por toda la explicación. Llevamos una mañana excepcional y ahora es hora de dividirnos en diferentes sesiones y mesas de trabajo. Pero antes vamos a contaros varias cosas importantes. Detrás de mí, en la pantalla, como podéis ver, ya están las sesiones y las salas en las que va a tener lugar para que cada uno pueda elegir, según su preferencia, en cuál de ellas quiere participar. Como veis en el primero, que será de 12:35, tal vez 5 minutillos de retraso, y hasta la 1:20, en el auditorio, en este en el que estamos, y también en las plantas 3 y 4 de este edificio. En la cuarta planta están un poco más limitadas las plazas, en el resto hay muchas más y como veis los que queráis participar en este auditorio pues no hace falta que os mováis del asiento. La comida será de 2:15 a 3:25 y durante cada uno de estos dos bloques tendréis que elegir cuáles de las 6 sesiones distintas que tendrán lugar, en cuál de ellas queréis participar. Así que hemos dicho ya todo lo del horario, hemos dicho también en qué salas y qué contenido tendrá lugar. Ahora vamos con el código QR. Todos los que estáis participando lo tenéis pues, justo aquí, lo vamos a poner también en la pantalla. Con este código, que también está en vuestra acreditación, como os digo, os da acceso a una agenda online donde se indican, además, concretamente todas las sesiones paralelas en cada uno de los slots. Así que ahí podréis ver la información también más específica. Y también podréis consultar la agenda en la pantalla lateral que hay justo en la entrada del hall. En este auditorio tendrá lugar la siguiente sesión, AI and Critical Thinking, así que los que queráis participar, pues aquí os podéis quedar. Y para el resto podéis subir a la planta tercera o a la cuarta del edificio, como decíamos, según vuestras preferencias. Un último mensaje. Bueno, en realidad son 5, pero muy breves. Termino con 5 mensajes importantes. El primero, en este auditorio y en el foro de la planta 3, como decía, hay bastante aforo, pero en las otras salas, en la de 4, hay limitación de unas 20 o 30 personas. En todas las salas podréis preguntar, ese es el punto número 2, a Emily, que como la habéis conocido esta mañana, es nuestra avatar. Podéis seguir haciéndole preguntas, podéis seguir alimentando este avatar personalizado para el evento, que luego además sacará conclusiones en las próximas semanas y que también va a ser parte de las sesiones, de todas y cada una de las sesiones en las que participéis. Otro mensaje importante, todas las sesiones se van a grabar, a transcribir y a incorporar a este motor de inteligencia artificial. Y ya a las 2:15 termina el segundo bloque de las sesiones paralelas de la mañana y todos podréis subir a la planta cuarta para comer, que también será necesario ese pequeño descanso. Tenemos casi 1 hora. Y último punto, y ya os dejo libres. Tendréis también acceso a muchos trabajadores y a muchos compañeros que están hoy con nosotros. A algunos los encontraréis con la palabra staff en las camisetas y están a vuestra entera disposición para que les hagáis las preguntas que necesitéis y para que podáis pues, también llegar a vuestras sesiones a tiempo y sin perderos por el camino. Regresamos aquí a las 3:30. Pedimos por favor puntualidad y hasta entonces, 3:30 p.m., please. We'll be back here. Thank you very much for everything.
Muy bien.